What's going on, guys? Max here, and I'm back with another video. And today we're going to be taking a look at camera settings and how choosing the right camera settings can change the way the video looks and feels. So how's it going, guys? It is Friday. Hopefully you guys have had a fun week so far. Personally, I had a pretty trashy week. We had a big star, Angry Grandpa, pass away. I made a vlog about that. Check it up here. It's, oh god. The second I saw the notification, a bad incident happened near my house. A bank robbery was almost about to occur this past Wednesday. That'll be in the next week's vlog. More about that later. Anyways, let's continue. Today's topic is camera settings. Camera settings are very, very important. It's something that's actually quite overlooked. When I got my camera, I was so uneducated with camera settings, and personally, I just grabbed my camera and just started filming. That's actually the thing you should do. Just grab your camera, whatever camera you have, either it's your cell phone, if you have a point and shoot, like one of these like camcorders, if you have a point and shoot, whatever camera you're using, just start using it. Don't worry about the settings immediately, just start playing around with it, and maybe after you filmed a little bit, maybe you could choose the settings. If you're ready to do the settings, if you've played around with your camera and you kind of feel like the picture quality and the way the video looks can be way better, the camera settings will definitely change the way the picture and video feels, because camera settings are different aspects of camera settings. You could change the speed of the video, you could change the frame rate in terms of 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and on. There are resolutions. My camera personally can only go up to 1080p full HD. Some cameras can have 4K. Then there are other things like shutter speed, then there's ISO, there's f-stop, and there's also color space. But personally, I feel like really important thing to talk about is the first four: frame rate, shutter, f-stop, and ISO. Those are the four settings that you should start tweaking as soon as you get your camera, or as soon as you're ready to play around more with your camera in terms of the settings wise. Okay, so the first one is frame rate. There are multiple different types of frame rates. Personally, I use 30 frames per second because it's the fastest frame rate that my camera can handle. The reason why I use 30 frames is obviously not just because it's the fastest, but because when I slow the video down to 50%, it's gonna be a little smoother than 24. I wish I had 60 frames or 120 frames, so when I slow down the video to 50 or 25%, the video wouldn't be as choppy. The best thing to shoot with if you want to have cinematic videos is 24 frames per second. So 24 frames per second is what every single Hollywood film has ever shot. Some movies are exceptions, like The Hobbit. It was shot at 48 frames per second for some reason. Some people don't like it. I don't really like The Hobbit in general, but most films are shot in 24 frames per second. And the reason why they look so smooth, even though they're shot at 24 frames per second, is because our eyes can only process 24 frames per second. And then you're probably asking me, so how do we process 30, 60, 120, all these crazy frame rates that we see in games, in cameras? Honestly, that's just beyond my knowledge. That's more scientific. So if you want to learn more about that, obviously do your homework, go research more about that. But what I know is human eye can only process 24 frames per second. So the thing is, 24 frames per second just has that like realistic motion blur, realistic just feel to it. 30 frames essentially takes out the extra motion blur, so there's not going to be as much motion blur. If you're filming at 60 frames per second, there's going to be less motion blur. So because if there's only 24 images per second that you see, there's a lot of motion blur. But when there's 60 frames, 60 pictures are being fit in the same amount of time as 24 pictures. So there's less motion blur because there's more pictures taking that spot that the motion blur would have taken if it was shot at 24 frames per second. So if you do want to get the cinematic feel, that really nice, good motion blurred, realistic cinematic feel, always shoot at 24 frames per second. If you want to do slow motion, obviously the higher the frame rate, the more smooth your video would feel when you're slowing it down. So now let's talk about aperture. Aperture is very important role. When you don't have the right aperture, you get this disgusting blown out image that just looks horrible and just doesn't work. It introduces more motion blur, looks really blown out, everything just looks disgusting, and it's just a horrifying, disgusting, filthy mess. So what you want to do is you want your aperture to always be double the frame rate. So for instance, let's say you're filming at 30 frames per second, which I am right now. You want your aperture to be double 30 frames, which means if I'm filming at 30, I want my aperture to be 60, because 30 times 2 is 60. And that gives you just the perfect amount of light coming in, doesn't distort, there isn't grain, there isn't disgusting noise coming in, there isn't too much light coming in. It's just the perfect amount of aperture. And let's also say you're filming at 24 frames per second. Same thing applies. The aperture is double the frame rate. So if you're filming at 24 frames per second, you want your aperture to be at 48. Also remember, not all cameras have 48 apertures. So if your camera doesn't have the option of 48 aperture, obviously choose 50 because that's the closest to 48. And this applies to if you have 60 frames per second, obviously do 120 aperture. Put the aperture to 120. It really just depends what frame rate you're using, but the most important thing to remember, always have the aperture double the frame rate, because then you're gonna get just the perfect amount of light coming in, and you're literally gonna be getting the most cinematic shot possible. If your picture looks way too blown out, way too bright, way too exposed, it doesn't look cinematic. When it's too dark, obviously it's more cinematic than really bright. Too dark is just obviously too dark. You can't really see what's going on, you can't really see the details. So when you double the aperture to the frame rate, you're getting just the perfect amount of light coming in, so it's literally for cinematic filming. Okay, so now let's talk about f-stop. F-stop is actually one of the most important ones. Okay, so f-stop depicts how sharp your image looks, how blurry the background is. So this is something that is very controversial and something that everybody cares about. A lot of people just want a blurry background. Everybody wants to have that nice, beautiful bokeh. People want to have that nice, beautiful, sharp looking image. For instance, if you're zooming in a macro lens and you're zooming into an eye or a flower or anything like that, the lower the f-stop, the blurrier the background, and the more detail in whatever you're trying to showcase is gonna have. So for instance, let's just say I took an orange and I filmed it, and I filmed it really close up at 18x55 lens, which is not meant for macro, it's not really a macro lens. Imagine we went up close. It's gonna be different if I shot it at 3.5 than at 5.6, or if I shot it on an even lower one. So for instance, 3.5 is the best that my lens can handle. So 3.5 is the best f-stop that my actual lens can handle, which means 3.5 is the one that I usually use because it's the closest to the best bokeh that I can actually get. So if I shoot at 5.6, not only does the video look a bit darker, not only does the video itself darken, but there's less bokeh, and now more of the background has even more detail. If you don't want to have a really nice bokeh or a really nice blurry background and you want to see everything, so if you're looking at me and everything behind me is in focus, you want to have a lower f-stop. If you want to have this really nice bokeh, try to get sort of the highest number possible, which is 3.5 on my lens. I'm going to be getting a 50mm, which is actually 1.8, which is a really low one, which means there's going to be very nice bokeh. So if you guys are looking to isolate your target, for instance, if you're taking a photo and you want that nice beautiful bokeh in the background, the higher the number, the better. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about ISO, or mostly referred to as ISO. It's pretty much how sensitive your image sensor is, which means if you have a very high number, for instance, you put your ISO to 6400, it's gonna look really blown out and just disgusting. It's gonna be horrible. There's gonna be so much grain introduced and so much noise. Noise is pretty much, it's so hard to explain, but it's just like as if it's like just looks horrible. You don't really want to know what it is. Just don't put your ISO too high, because the sensor just becomes way too sensitive and everything just looks horrible. So make sure that the goal is to try to have the lowest ISO possible, because it's going to give you the most, like the sharpest and the most clean looking image, which means more professional and more cinematic looking images. Sometimes you want to have that grainy look, which then you could bring up the ISO, but also the problem is when you bring up the ISO, the brightness, like it gets brighter each time you do it. So, and also the bad part is when you bring it all the way down, trying to get the most, like the sharpest image and the less grain and noise, you kind of introduce less light, which means you got to put more time and a lot more lighting into your videos, which means when you're filming a vlog, you kind of have to bring that ISO way up there just so you're actually able to see what you're doing. But right now I'm using 200 ISO. Nice, really great. I have a nice light right here in front of me, a softbox right in front of me, giving just enough light. Also these ambient lighting on top of me that gives just the perfect amount of lighting where it's perfect. For instance, I could bring down the ISO if I want to make it more cinematic. Personally, to me, shots have to be very more on the darker side. Like if it's a bright video, to me it's not really cinematic. It has to be more on the darker side. If it's dark to the point where you can't even really tell details, that's when it's not cinematic. But it has to be sort of more dim and darker than usual. It gives that really nice sort of like cinematic feel to it. So honestly, try to keep it below 400 ISO. Honestly, 800 ISO should be the most you should ever go up. Maybe 1600 is the most you should ever go up. Don't use 32 or 64. That just looks disgusting. The only time you should ever use 32 or 64 is if you're actually trying to go for more of like that grainy look. But if you're just trying to get like the best possible footage without grain and without noise, try to stay at the 800 and lower range. So yeah guys, that's pretty much it. Like, that's all the settings done here. We talked about frame rates, like the proper frame rates. For instance, like we said, 24 frames per second is the most cinematic one that all Hollywood films shoot at. For instance, we also talked about aperture. So we talked about how it lets in light. The fact that you want to double aperture to your frame rate. So if I'm filming at 24, you want to have an aperture of 50. It makes sense. Just the perfect amount of light is coming in that to the point where it's not too blown out or too dark, so it looks really nice and cinematic. If you did, be sure to click the red subscribe button. I make multiple of these types of videos. It would really be awesome if you could go down there, click it, so you guys can stay tuned for more videos. Be sure to share the videos too, because honestly, the more people that find these videos, the longer you guys watch them, the higher the chances of them being suggested to people that actually care about the videos. Because I don't want my video to be suggested to or found by somebody that's just trying to find videos to watch because they're bored. I want my videos to be watched by people that actually care about the thing I'm talking about. I want this video about settings for people that actually care about filming, that want to get good settings. And just that's about all the types of videos that I want to do. I want you guys to share it with people that is meaningful. And not only share it, just watch the video throughout. The longer you guys watch my video, the higher the chances of my video being suggested. And also, if you share the video, the more views it gets, the higher the chances of YouTube suggesting it. Anyways, I will see you guys in my next video. Peace out. Let's in light. It's sort of like the shutter speed of the camera. Oh my god, I'm stupid.